Hey there. Tonight we start with whispers from a world where women danced on the razor's edge between art and servitude. Welcome to the shadowed corners of Korea's Joseon dynasty, where Jising women moved like ghosts through history, and you probably won't survive the first royal banquet without offending someone who could have your head on a pike by morning. So now kill the overhead lights, maybe light a candle, and let's get into some history. The story of Korea's Jisings doesn't begin with the Joseon dynasty at all, but rather emerges like a half-remembered dream from the hazy Three Kingdoms period, centuries earlier. Congratulations, you're in the 6th century now, and already there are records of women trained in music and dance to entertain nobility. These early entertainers were called wonhwa during the Silla Kingdom, and as you might expect, their status was complicated. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit palace hall around 576 CE. The air is thick with incense, and as your eyes adjust, you notice women moving through the shadows, carrying instruments and wearing clothes that mark them as something separate from the noble ladies seated rigidly along the walls. These are the spiritual ancestors of the Jising, and they already occupy that liminal space between servant and artist that would define the profession for over 1,000 years. The word Jising itself wouldn't come into use until much later, during the Goryeo dynasty from 918 to 1392 CE. If you're struggling to keep your timelines straight as you drift toward sleep, just remember, Goryeo came before Joseon, and it's where we get the Western name Korea from. Convenient, isn't it? During this period, these women were organized into a system called Jayabang, which quite literally established government bureaus of entertainment. You might be thinking that this sounds rather bureaucratic for something as ephemeral as art and entertainment, but that's precisely the point. The Korean kingdoms, and later the Joseon dynasty, didn't leave these women to develop their talents in some organic, free-spirited way. No, this was a government-controlled system from the very beginning. By the time the Joseon dynasty established itself in 1392, the Jising system was already thoroughly institutionalized. They inherited this system from Goryeo. And this is crucial for understanding what follows. The Neo-Confucian scholars who dominated the Joseon government viewed it with considerably more puritanical suspicion. Picture yourself now in the early Joseon period, perhaps around 1400. You're walking through the capital of Hanseong, modern-day Seoul, and the streets are buzzing with the energy of a dynasty that believes it's creating a perfect Confucian society. Men in distinctive black hats and formal robes hurry past you, discussing matters of state and philosophy. Women are largely absent from public spaces, secreted away in inner chambers of homes, except, that is, for the Jisings. They're walking through the same streets you are, though they move differently. Their presence is both sanctioned and stigmatized, necessary yet shameful to the men who create and enforce the rigid social hierarchies. These women are registered in government records, classified, and assigned to various government offices and regional districts. They belong to the state in a very real and terrifying sense. In these early days of Joseon, there were approximately 100,000 Jissings registered throughout the country. Think about that number for a moment as you sink deeper into your pillow. 100,000 women, each with her own story, her own talents, her own strategies for survival, in a system that valued her skills, but not her humanity. The origins of many of these women were tragic by any modern standard. Some were from families ruined by political purges, a distressingly common occurrence in early Joseon politics. When a scholar official fell from grace, his entire family might be punished, with daughters sometimes being relegated to Jissing status. Others were sold by impoverished families who couldn't afford to feed them, while some were the daughters of existing Jissings, inheriting their mother's status in a cruel generational cycle. And then there were those who were simply stolen. Yes, kidnapped, often from families of the commoner class, Yeonjin, who lacked the political connections to demand their return. Think about that the next time you idealize pre-modern societies. A young girl could be walking home from fetching water and simply disappear, reappearing months later in a government registry of entertainers, with no recourse and no way home. By the mid-15th century, King Sejong the Great, the same visionary who gave Korea its Hangul alphabet, attempted to reduce the number of Jissings and improve their treatment. In 1430, he ordered that the total number be limited to 1,127, distributed among the various government offices and regional districts. It was an attempt at reform, but one that ultimately reinforced the institutionalization of these women, rather than questioning the fundamental nature of the system. What's particularly interesting about the early Joseon period is how the Jissing system survived at all under Neo-Confucianism. The dominant philosophy of the time placed extraordinary emphasis on female chastity and segregation of the sexes. Women of good families were increasingly confined to inner chambers, while men conducted public life. The ideal woman was one who was never seen or heard outside her household. And yet, here were the Jissings, singing, dancing, composing poetry, and conversing with men who weren't their husbands or family members. The contradiction was resolved, if you can call it that, by placing Jissings firmly outside the bounds of respectable society. They were classified as members of the Chinmin, the lowest class of society, alongside butchers, shamans, and slaves. This classification as Chinmin is crucial to understanding how Jissings survived in Joseon Korea, because it established the fundamental paradox of their existence. They were simultaneously the most accomplished women in society, masters of poetry, music, dance, art, and conversation, and the most socially debased. They could speak directly to kings and prime ministers, an access unimaginable to most common women, yet had fewer rights than the lowliest peasant wife. As you're drifting closer to sleep, try to hold that contradiction in your mind. Supreme artistic achievement paired with profound social degradation. It's in that tension that the Jising story unfolds across the 5 centuries of Joseon rule. By the late 15th century, the Jisings were divided into 3 broad categories that would persist throughout most of the dynasty. The highest rank were the Xianbai Jising, who served at the royal court and official state functions. Below them were the middle-rank Jisings, who worked at government offices in the capital and provinces. The lowest rank consisted of local Jisings, who served at government offices in remote areas. This 3-tiered system wasn't just administrative bureaucracy. It determined everything from a woman's daily duties to her chances of survival in old age. A high-ranking Jising might be summoned to court to perform for foreign envoys or compose poetry with scholar officials, while a lower-ranking one might find herself serving alcohol and providing sexual services to local magistrates. As the 15th century gave way to the 16th, the system continued to evolve, shaped by the political needs of the state, the cultural tastes of the elite, and the survival strategies of the women themselves. What remained constant was the fundamental tension between artistry and servitude, between power and powerlessness, that defined the Jising experience. In a society that valued female invisibility as a virtue, these women developed a paradoxical visibility. They appeared in poetry, in paintings, in the private diaries of scholar officials, and in official government records. They left traces where other women disappeared entirely from historical memory. And as we'll see in the next part of our journey, they learned to navigate the rigid class hierarchies of Joseon Korea in ways that sometimes allowed them to transcend their assigned place, though never without cost. The foundations had been laid. The stage was set. The women were registered, categorized, and distributed throughout the kingdom. As the Joseon dynasty settled into its stride, the Jising system would become one of its most distinctive and contradictory institutions, a shadow world where power, art, exploitation, and occasional triumph existed in uneasy balance. Now that you're comfortably settling into the rhythm of our story, let's examine how Jisings occupied a class unto themselves, one with tremendous cultural capital, but virtually no actual power. The paradox might keep you awake for just a few more minutes. Joseon Korea operated on a social stratification system that would make even the most hierarchical European society look positively egalitarian. At the top sat the Yongbin, the scholar official class who had passed the rigorous civil service examinations. Below them were the Chungin, a small middle class of technical specialists like interpreters and physicians. Then came the enormous Sangmin class, common farmers, merchants, and artisans who formed the backbone of the economy. At the very bottom were the Chenmin, the base people, a category that included butchers, tanners, shamans, slaves, and our Jisings. Imagine yourself as a young Jising in, say, 1512. You've been trained in classical Chinese poetry. You can play 3 instruments flawlessly. Your calligraphy makes scholars and officials weep with envy, and your dance movements could entrance a stone Buddha. Yet, legally speaking, you rank somewhere between a gravedigger and an executioner. The Chinmin designation carried concrete consequences. Like other Chinmin, Jissings couldn't participate in the civil service examinations that were the pathway to power. They couldn't own property outside designated areas. They were required to wear specific clothes that marked their status, though ironically, these were often more colorful and elaborate than what respectable women could wear. And of course, they couldn't marry into higher social classes. But here's where things get peculiar. Despite being classified among the lowest members of society, Jissings had access to elite spaces and powerful individuals that even upper-class women couldn't dream of. A Yongbin woman would spend her life in seclusion, rarely meeting men outside her immediate family. A Jissing, by contrast, might entertain governors, ministers, even the king himself. This access created a strange social inversion. Jissings were often more educated than aristocratic women, who typically learned only enough reading and writing to manage household affairs. The famous 16th century Jissing Hwang, Jinyi reportedly composed poetry that impressed even the most learned scholars, while many Yongbin wives could barely sign their names. Jissings studied Chinese classics, history, and literature, subjects normally reserved for elite men. Their artistic accomplishments were publicly recognized in a way that was unthinkable for respectable women. In 1526, when the famous Jissing Nangi sacrificed herself to kill a Japanese general during the Imjin War by embracing him and jumping off a cliff, her heroism was recorded in official histories. This public recognition was practically unheard of for women of other classes. Yet this recognition came with a fundamental powerlessness that defined the Jissing experience. Let's be clear about something that historical romanticism often obscures. Jissings were, in essence, government property. They were registered in official ledgers called Jaijak and assigned identification tags known as Hopi. They could be summoned at any time by government officials, and refusing was not an option, at least not without serious consequences. A document from 1545 describes the punishment for a Jissing who failed to appear when summoned: 30 lashes with a bamboo cane. For comparison, that's the same punishment administered to petty thieves and fraudsters. Another record from 1567 mentions a provincial governor who had 3 Jissings beaten nearly to death for arriving late to an official banquet. Their movements were restricted. They needed permission to travel between districts. If they wanted to visit family in another province, they required official documentation. Some managed to bribe their way around these restrictions, but those without connections or resources were effectively trapped within their assigned jurisdictions. Even their artistic expression had boundaries. A Jissing's poetry might be admired, but if it contained anything that could be construed as criticism of the government or social order, the consequences could be severe. In 1576, a Jissing named Urim was reportedly exiled to a remote island for composing a poem that was interpreted as mocking a powerful minister. She died in exile, her art effectively silenced, The physical reality of Jising life reflected this fundamental lack of control. Most lived in government-owned quarters called Jiabangchang, where their activities could be monitored and controlled. In the capital and major provincial centers, these quarters became known as Jising houses. But make no mistake, these weren't independent businesses. They were extensions of government offices, specifically the Yonsenguk, departments responsible for music and entertainment. By the mid-16th century, there was a growing practice of private ownership of Jisings, with wealthy individuals adopting talented girls or purchasing them outright. This further complicated the class status of these women, as they occupied a peculiar position somewhere between servant and artist, between property and cultural treasure. Sex, since I know that's what some of you are wondering about as you drift toward sleep, was absolutely part of the equation, though not universally or uniformly. The highest-ranking Jisings, particularly those who served at court functions, might never provide sexual services, focusing exclusively on artistic performance. Middle and lower-ranking Jisings, however, were generally expected to serve officials in every capacity requested. This is where we need to pause and consider what this meant for the women involved. Contrary to the romanticized image of Jisings as glamorous courtesans freely choosing their lovers, the reality for many was a form of sexual servitude sanctioned by the state. A Jising couldn't refuse the advances of an official to whom she was assigned. Consent, as we understand it today, was simply not part of the equation. Some scholars have argued that high-ranking Jisings had more agency in selecting patrons, but even this needs qualification. A Jising might prefer one official over another, but she operated within a system that denied her fundamental bodily autonomy. The choice was rarely whether to have sexual relationships, but rather with whom, when possible. Let's consider a typical day for a mid-ranking Jising in a provincial capital around 1580. She wakes before dawn to practice her instruments and review any new songs or poems she's been ordered to learn. By mid-morning, she's attending to her assigned duties at the local government office, perhaps copying documents or preparing tea for visiting officials. In the afternoon, she might be summoned to entertain at a banquet for a visiting dignitary. She performs songs, dances, serves drinks, and engages in witty conversation, all while navigating the complex social dynamics of men who have absolute power over her. The banquet stretches late into the night, and at its conclusion, she may be requested to accompany an official to his quarters. The next morning, she begins again, her personal desires entirely subordinate to the demands of her position. If she falls ill, there might be brief reprieve, but prolonged illness could lead to punishment or reassignment to more menial duties. If she grows old and her beauty fades, she faces the prospect of being degraded to servant status, essentially becoming a maid to younger Jisings. Yet, despite these harsh realities, Jisings created their own internal hierarchies and community structures that helped them navigate their precarious position. By the late 16th century, older Jisings often took on administrative roles, managing the training and assignments of younger women. These senior Jisings called Jayabang Iyaj, wielded considerable influence within the Jising community and sometimes developed important connections with officials that allowed them to protect their subordinates from the worst abuses. Unofficial mentorship systems developed, with experienced Jisings teaching newcomers not just artistic skills, but survival strategies, how to flatter a particular type of official, when to appear deferent, and when to assert artistic expertise, which men were dangerous and which might become protectors. This underground knowledge transmission was crucial to surviving the contradictions of being simultaneously exalted and debased. Some Jisings formed sisterhood bonds called Jayamoim, pooling resources and supporting each other through illness, pregnancy, or when facing punishment. These informal networks created a measure of security in an otherwise deeply insecure existence. Records from the late 16th century mention Jayamoim members collecting money to buy medicine for a sick sister or bribing officials to reduce another's punishment. There are even accounts of Jisings adopting abandoned baby girls, bringing them into the profession not out of cruelty, but as a form of rescue and continuity. A government document from 1592 mentions a Jising named Hanul, who took in 3 orphaned girls during the chaos of the Japanese invasion, training them in music and dance as a means of ensuring their survival. These community structures reveal something essential about how Jisings survived in Joseon Korea. They created parallel systems of value and support within the constraints imposed by their formal classification. Their official status might have been base people, but among themselves, they developed sophisticated rankings based on artistic skill, intellect, and strategic acumen. By the dawn of the 17th century, as the dynasty recovered from the devastation of the Imjin War, the Jising class had become an established paradox within Joseon society, institutionally powerless, yet culturally influential, legally degraded, yet artistically elevated. This contradiction would define their existence through the centuries that followed, as they continuously adapted to shifting political winds and social expectations. The very rigidity of the class system that trapped them also created the conditions for their unique cultural position. In a society where social mobility was virtually non-existent, Jisings occupied a rare liminal space, moving between worlds that were otherwise strictly separated. This mobility, limited though it was, became both their burden and their opportunity. Now let's explore the academies where young girls were transformed into Jisings, a process that was equal parts artistic education and systematic subjugation. The training grounds where survival skills were forged in the kiln of discipline. The Jayabang, literally teaching room, was the institutional heart of the Jising system. These government-run academies existed in the capital and every major provincial town, operating as combination training schools, administrative centers, and performance venues. If you're imagining some romantic vision of a finishing school for accomplished young ladies, allow me to gently replace that with something closer to a practical arts prison with occasional moments of beauty. By the early 17th century, the Jiabang system had developed into a highly structured institution. Girls typically entered training between the ages of 8 and 13. Some were the daughters of existing Jissings, inheriting their mother's status in a cycle that could span generations. Others were purchased from impoverished families or acquired through less savory means. A government document from 1608 notes the case of a local magistrate who recruited 4 young girls from families who had fallen behind on their taxes. The training itself was brutally intensive. A typical day began before dawn with vocal exercises, followed by instrumental practice, dance training, and lessons in classical Chinese literature. The physical demands were extraordinary. Young trainees might spend 6 hours daily perfecting dance movements alone. One account from 1623 describes girls practicing leg positions until their ankle joints cracked and bled through their white cotton socks. Discipline was maintained through a combination of corporal punishment and psychological conditioning. Mistakes during practice could result in beatings with bamboo rods or deprivation of meals. A senior Jissing's memoir from the 1640s mentions a training mistress who would burn incense sticks on the forearms of girls who failed to maintain proper posture while playing the geojiam, a 12-stringed zither. Yet alongside this harshness existed genuine artistic mentorship. The same memoir praises another instructor who taught me to hear the voice of the wind in my geojiam strings. The training wasn't just brutal conditioning, it was also the transmission of artistic traditions that stretched back centuries. These girls weren't merely being trained to please, they were being initiated into profound cultural lineages. The curriculum was surprisingly extensive. By the mid-17th century, Jissing trainees were expected to master several categories of skills. First came the yonggi, or performance arts, singing, dancing, and playing instruments like the geojiam, jiomungo 6-stringed zither, hijiam 2-stringed fiddle, and dijiam large bamboo flute. Then there were the yeomen, or refined arts, poetry composition, calligraphy, painting, and tea ceremony. The highest-ranking Jissings were expected to compose impromptu poems in both Korean and classical Chinese, often engaging in poetic exchanges with scholarly officials. Some trainees specialized in specific literary forms, like the sijō, a traditional 3-line Korean verse form. Finally came the practical arts called sarang, which included conversation skills, wine-pouring etiquette, board games like Baduk, similar to Go, and various forms of entertainment appropriate for different occasions. These skills were taught with excruciating attention to detail. A training manual from 1632 devotes 6 pages to the proper angle at which to hold a wine pitcher when serving different ranks of officials. What's fascinating is that this curriculum gave Jissings an education far superior to what was available to most women in Joseon society. While daughters of the Yongbin elite might receive basic literacy training and instruction in Confucian virtues, few were taught classical Chinese literature or philosophy. Jissings, by contrast, studied the Confucian classics, major works of Chinese poetry, and historical texts. This created the peculiar situation where the most educated women in society were also among the most socially degraded. A Jissing might be able to discuss the nuances of Tang dynasty poetry with a government minister, while his wife, technically her social superior, could barely read simple texts in Hangul, the Korean alphabet. The psychological dimension of Jissing training was perhaps its most insidious aspect. Girls were systematically taught to suppress their own emotions and desires in favor of projecting whatever persona would please their patrons. A training document from 1645 instructs teachers to ensure that trainees could laugh when sad and appear delighted when exhausted. This emotional conditioning was as rigorous as the artistic training. They were also taught to read the subtle cues of power and hierarchical relationships. A senior Jissing's notes from around 1650 advise, when two officials of equal rank disagree in your presence, attend more carefully to the one with brothers in higher positions. This political awareness wasn't part of the formal curriculum, but it was essential knowledge passed from experienced Jissings to novices. By their mid-teens, trainees would begin accompanying senior Jissings to official functions, first as observers and assistants, then gradually taking on more prominent roles. This apprenticeship period was crucial. It was where theoretical training met practical application, and where girls learned the unwritten rules of survival. The formal training period typically lasted 6 to 8 years, after which a Jissing would be assigned her official ranking and duties. But in truth, the learning never ended. Throughout their careers, Jissings continued refining their skills, adapting to changing fashions, and expanding their repertoires. Those who survived into their 30s often became instructors themselves, transmitting both the formal curriculum and the shadow education in survival strategies. Let's peer into a specific training moment, shall we? It's 1657, and you're observing a dance class at the Jiabang in Pyongyang, known for producing particularly skilled performers. 20 young trainees move in careful unison, sleeves extended, feet tracing precise patterns on the wooden floor. The instructor, a former court Jissing now in her 40s, walks between them with a thin bamboo stick. "Your eyes tell the story more than your hands," she says, tapping the stick lightly against a girl's cheek to adjust the angle of her gaze. "When you perform the spring Oriole dance for Governor Kim next month, he will be seated to your left. Your eyes must find him at the third measure. Hold his gaze for 2 beats, then demurely look away. Too brief and you appear disinterested. Too long and you seem impertinent." This micromanagement of expression and gesture wasn't just artistic direction. It was survival instruction. Pleasing patrons wasn't merely about delivering aesthetic experiences. It was about navigating power imbalances where the consequences of failure could be severe. The training system also evolved over time in response to changing political and cultural conditions. During the relatively stable middle period of the Joseon dynasty, from roughly 1650 to 1750, training became more standardized across provinces. Regional Jiabang developed specialties. Pyongyang became known for dance, Jeolla province for Gaejeom players, and Jeonju for poets. There were also specialized training tracks by the late 17th century. Some Jissings were specifically trained for diplomatic functions, learning basic Japanese or Manchu phrases to entertain foreign envoys. Others specialized in medical arts, combining entertainment skills with knowledge of herbal medicines and therapeutic massage. These medical Jissings, called Yakbeng Jissing, occupied yet another liminal space between healthcare provider and entertainer. One particularly fascinating development was the emergence of private Jayabeng outside the government system. By the early 18th century, some retired Jissings established independent training houses where they taught performance arts to both Jissing trainees and occasionally to daughters of wealthy merchants. These private academies created alternative pathways into the profession and sometimes served as havens for women fleeing difficult circumstances. The government periodically attempted to suppress these private Jayabeng, seeing them as challenges to state control of the Jissing system. A royal edict from 1712 ordered the closure of 37 unauthorized training houses in the capital, claiming they were corrupting proper distinction between classes. By teaching Yongbin household girls alongside Jissing trainees. Despite these crackdowns, private training persisted, creating cracks in the otherwise rigid institutional structure. By the mid-18th century, there were effectively two parallel systems: the official government Jayabeng that supplied Jissings for state functions, and a shadow network of private academies producing performers for merchant gatherings and wealthy individuals. This dual system reflected broader social changes in the late Joseon period as the merchant class gained economic power and began adopting cultural practices previously reserved for the Yongbin elite. The training of Jissings, originally a state monopoly, gradually became partially privatized, though always under threat of government intervention. What remained constant across these shifts was the fundamental purpose of Jissing training: to create women who could move fluidly between artistic excellence and servile accommodation, between cultural sophistication and physical availability. The contradiction at the heart of the Jissing's social position was reinforced from their earliest training days. Consider the daily routine of a typical trainee around 1720. She wakes at dawn and begins with hygiene and appearance maintenance, learning to wash with particular herbal concoctions to brighten the complexion, applying rice powder to whiten the skin, arranging her hair in one of dozens of styles appropriate to her status and age. Before she touches an instrument or practices a dance step, she learns that her body is both her art and her commodity. Next come the artistic practices, 4 to 6 hours of rigorous training in music, dance, and literature. This portion of the day might almost resemble education at an elite conservatory, with genuine attention to artistic excellence and cultural depth. Teachers correct her finger positions on the Geogeum strings with the same seriousness a modern conservatory professor might show a promising student. But then the training shifts to what we might call service practices, lessons in how to pour wine without wrinkling one's sleeve, how to laugh appealingly at a patron's joke without appearing overfamiliar, how to sit for hours in uncomfortable positions without showing pain. She learns to read subtle power dynamics among officials, to anticipate needs before they're expressed, to make herself simultaneously visible as an object of appreciation and invisible as a person with needs of her own. This duality was the essence of Jising training, the creation of women who embodied both cultural refinement and servile availability, who possessed artistic agency but limited personal autonomy. It's a contradiction that runs through the entire history of the institution, and one that individual women navigated with varying degrees of success and suffering. By the time a trainee completed her formal education and received her official designation, she had been thoroughly molded by this system. She emerged with extraordinary artistic skills and equally developed survival strategies, prepared to enter a world where her talents might bring her fame, favor, and occasional moments of genuine artistic fulfillment, but never true freedom or social equality. These academies of refined submission produced women uniquely equipped to navigate the treacherous waters of Joseon society, women who might dazzle with their artistry while carefully calculating their next move in the perpetual chess game of survival. Let's now examine the artistic arsenal that Jisings developed weapons of culture that were simultaneously their means of livelihood, their tools for advancement, and occasionally their path to some measure of autonomy. As you drift deeper into our historical dreamscape, consider how these women weaponized beauty in their fight for survival. The primary weapon in the Jising's arsenal was undoubtedly music. By the mid-Joseon period, accomplished Jisings were expected to master at least 3 instruments, typically the Geogeum, 12-stringed zither, the Geomungo, 6-stringed zither, and either the Higeum, 2-stringed fiddle, or Digeum, bamboo flute. These weren't casual accomplishments. These women practiced for thousands of hours, developing technical skills that would impress conservatory-trained musicians today. The Geogeum, in particular, became almost synonymous with Jising artistry. Its 12 silk strings, stretched over movable bridges on a paulownia wood body, produced sounds that ranged from delicate whispers to commanding declarations. A skilled Geogeum player could mimic natural sounds, flowing water, rustling leaves, distant thunder, or express complex emotional states through subtle variations in pressure and vibrato. There's a story from 1742 about a Jising named Walwa who allegedly saved herself from severe punishment after offending a provincial governor. When brought before him to receive her sentence, she asked to play one final piece on the Geogeum. Her performance was so moving that the governor not only pardoned her, but became her patron. While possibly apocryphal, the tale reflects a fundamental truth. Exceptional skill could sometimes transcend the rigid boundaries of class and gender. Dance formed the second pillar of the Jising's artistic identity. Joseon-era Jising dances fell into several categories: the elegant court dances, Jeongyi, more dynamic folk dances, Minsakchum, and ritualistic shamanic dances, Mumu. Each required different techniques and expressed different aspects of Korean cultural identity. Court dances, like the Chuningmu Spring Nightingale dance, emphasized restraint and precision, subtle movements of sleeves, carefully controlled footwork, and precise head positions. Folk dances allowed for more expressive movement, incorporating elements of narrative and sometimes humor. Ritualistic dances often included trance-like states and were performed at seasonal festivals or ceremonies to ensure good harvests or ward off disease. A Jising's dance training wasn't just about learning choreography. It was about mastering a complex language of gesture and expression. A tilt of the head, the angle of a wrist, the speed at which a sleeve unfurled all conveyed specific meanings to knowledgeable observers. For patrons educated in this visual language, watching a skilled Jising dance was like reading poetry in motion. The third weapon was poetry and literary composition. Elite Jisings were expected to compose verse spontaneously, often participating in poetry exchanges with scholar officials. These weren't mere parlor games. They were high-stakes demonstrations of intellectual capacity that could significantly affect a Jising's reputation and prospects. Take the famous Jising Eichuang Jinyi, who lived in the 16th century. Her Sizhou poems weren't just technically accomplished. They were subversive commentaries on her position in society. In one famous verse, she wrote, "I will break the back of this long midwinter night, fold it double, and stuff it beneath the spring quilt, that my loved one may come back sooner." On its surface, it's a love poem about longing, but scholars have noted how it also expresses agency. She's not passively waiting, but actively manipulating time itself. This kind of subtle resistance through artistic expression became a hallmark of Jising poetry. Beyond these core artistic skills, Jisings cultivated a fourth weapon: conversational dexterity. This meant not just speaking well, but knowing exactly what to say to whom and when. A Jising entertaining government officials needed to be sufficiently informed about politics to follow discussions, but careful never to express opinions that might offend. She needed to appear interested in topics that bored her, laugh at jokes she'd heard dozens of times, and make each patron feel uniquely appreciated. This conversational art extended to what we might call emotional intelligence. Jisings became expert readers of microexpressions, tone shifts, and body language. They could detect when a powerful man was in a dangerous mood, when flattery would be well received versus when it would be perceived as manipulation, and when to speak versus when to listen appreciatively. A training manual from the 1760s advises Jisings to watch the eyebrows, not the mouth, when officials speak, suggesting that the true meaning often lay in expression rather than words. Another text recommends memorizing the genealogies and factional affiliations of major families, essential knowledge for navigating the treacherous waters of Joseon politics. The fifth weapon in the Jising arsenal was calligraphy and painting. By the 18th century, Jising paintings, particularly of orchids, plum blossoms, and bamboo, all symbols of perseverance and integrity, had become collectible items. Some Jisings specialized in particular subjects. There are records of a Jising named Salwa, who was renowned for her paintings of cats, while another named Chenhua specialized in landscape scenes of Mount Jumgang. Calligraphy offered another avenue for artistic expression and potential patronage. A beautifully rendered poem could become a cherished gift, establishing ongoing connections with powerful patrons. Some Jissings developed distinctive calligraphic styles that became their artistic signatures. The 18th century Jissing Xiaojingmi was known for her drunken grass script, a flowing style that suggested both mastery and artistic abandon. These artistic weapons weren't deployed in isolation, but rather in strategic combinations tailored to specific situations and patrons. A Jissing entertaining a scholarly official might emphasize literary skills and subtle musical performances, while one assigned to military officers might showcase more dramatic dances and engaging storytelling. The deployment of these skills was also highly seasonal and contextual. Different artistic expressions were appropriate for different occasions. Spring flower viewing parties called for light, celebratory performances. Autumn moon viewing gatherings required more contemplative, melancholic arts. Official banquets demanded formal court music and dance. Private entertaining allowed for more intimate artistic expressions. Beyond these formal artistic accomplishments, Jissings developed what we might call shadow skills, unofficial arts that proved equally crucial to survival. Chief among these was the art of strategic alliance building. Successful Jissings cultivated networks of patrons, supporters, and protectors, carefully maintaining connections across factional lines to ensure they wouldn't fall with any single political group. A particularly interesting shadow skill was information brokerage. Because Jissings moved between different social circles and political factions, they often possessed valuable intelligence about court politics, regional affairs, or commercial matters. Some leveraged this knowledge to secure protection or favorable treatment, discreetly trading information with officials who valued being well informed. There are documented cases of Jissings who served as political messengers between factions that couldn't openly communicate. During the factional struggles of the late 17th century, certain Jissings reportedly carried coded messages between opposing political camps. Their movements between different officials' residences, raising no suspicions because they were expected to entertain across factional lines. Medical knowledge constituted another valuable weapon in the Jissing arsenal. Many developed expertise in herbal medicine, acupressure, and therapeutic massage skills that ensured they remained useful even as their youth and beauty faded. Some specialized in treating particular ailments. Records mention a Jissing named Walha, who was sought after for her effective treatments for gout, a common affliction among sedentary scholar officials who overindulged in rich foods. Culinary arts also became an important area of expertise. Jissings often supervised the preparation of special dishes for banquets and private entertainments. Some became known for signature recipes. The 18th century Jissing Mihua reportedly created a specific type of persimmon wine that became so popular it was still being produced according to her recipe a century after her death. For the most ambitious Jissings, perhaps the ultimate weapon was psychological manipulation, not in a malicious sense, but as a refined understanding of human desire and ego. The most successful practitioners could make powerful men feel intellectually appreciated, physically desired, and emotionally understood, creating bonds of attachment that transcended the transactional nature of their official relationship. A memoir from the 1790s, written by a retired government official, describes his decades-long relationship with a Jising named Chun Hyang, not the fictional character from the famous tale, but a real woman who apparently adopted the name. She remembered every poem I had ever shared with her, could sense my mood before I spoke a word, and somehow made me believe that in her presence I became my truest self. This cultivation of emotional dependency represented the pinnacle of Jising artistry, the ability to transform their assigned role as servants into positions of subtle influence. The wisest among them wielded this power carefully, aware that too obvious a display of manipulation could trigger dangerous backlash. As the 18th century progressed into the 19th, economic changes in Joseon society created new artistic opportunities for Jisings. The rising merchant class, increasingly wealthy but lacking the social status of the Yongbin, became important patrons of Jising arts. These nouveau rich merchants often spent lavishly to experience the cultural refinement traditionally associated with the aristocracy. This emerging patron class had different tastes and expectations than traditional Yongbin patrons. They often preferred more entertaining, less scholarly performances, leading some Jisings to develop skills in storytelling, comedic performances, and more accessible musical forms. By the early 19th century, some Jisings were performing in pansari, a form of musical storytelling that combined narrative elements with dramatic singing and was more appealing to common audiences than classical court music. This diversification of artistic offerings reflected the Jising's perpetual adaptation to changing social conditions. Their survival depended on their ability to read not just individual patrons, but broader cultural and economic shifts, adjusting their artistic arsenal accordingly. The most poignant aspect of Jising artistry was perhaps its impermanence. Despite their often extraordinary talents, very few Jisings left lasting artistic legacies that survived in their own names. Their poems might be recorded in the collections of male patrons, often without attribution. Their musical innovations were absorbed into traditional repertoires without credit. Their paintings and calligraphy, if preserved at all, often lost their provenance over time. This erasure wasn't accidental. It reflected the fundamental devaluation of Jising artistry, despite its acknowledged excellence. Their art was appreciated in the moment, but rarely preserved as cultural heritage in the way that works by male artists were. A few exceptional cases stand out. Wang Jinya's poems survived, as did those of a handful of other famous Jisings. But these are exceptions that prove the rule. The true testament to Jising artistic influence lies not in individually attributed works, but in their collective impact on Korean cultural forms. Many musical techniques, dance movements, and poetic innovations that originated with Jissings were incorporated into the mainstream artistic tradition. They were, in many ways, the invisible artisans of Joseon cultural development. As we near the end of our exploration of the Jissing artistic arsenal, it's worth noting that these skills didn't guarantee survival or success. Many highly talented women still suffered abuse, poverty, and obscurity despite their accomplishments. Artistic excellence was a necessary but not sufficient condition for navigating the treacherous waters of Jissing life. Yet for those who managed to deploy their artistic weapons effectively, complementing technical mastery with political acumen and psychological insight, the rewards could be substantial. Financial security, protection from the worst abuses of the system, and occasionally relationships that offered genuine emotional connection and respect. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine these women practicing in the pre-dawn darkness, refining techniques that might never be historically credited to them, developing artistic expressions that would shape Korean culture while their individual names were largely forgotten. Their artistry was both their lifeline and their legacy, weapons in a lifelong battle, not just for survival, but for meaning in a system designed to deny them full humanity. Let's draw back the painted screens and peer into the hidden chambers where Jissings lived when they weren't performing. Imagine awakening in a Jissing house around 1780, in a small room shared with 2 or 3 other women. The room itself would be modest, perhaps 8 feet square, with simple andal floor, heating in winter, a few storage chests pushed against the walls, sleeping mats rolled up in the corner, and a shared vanity table crowded with cosmetic containers and hair ornaments. If you're picturing luxurious silken chambers with ornate furnishings, I'm afraid reality was considerably more utilitarian for all but the most celebrated Jissings. The day would begin early, typically before dawn. A senior Jissing or house manager, often a retired Jissing herself, would wake the women with a wooden clapper. The first hour would be devoted to appearance preparation. This wasn't a matter of vanity, but professional necessity. Skin was whitened with rice powder or lead-based cosmetics. Yes, slowly poisoning themselves for beauty standards is hardly a modern invention. Eyebrows were plucked and redrawn in fashionable shapes. Hair was elaborately styled, a process that could take over an hour for formal occasions. One fascinating detail from a medical text of the period notes that many Jissings suffered from localized baldness due to the tight hairstyles they were required to maintain. The text recommends a treatment involving crushed sesame seeds and mugwort oil, though it acknowledges that the only true cure was to wear looser styles, an option unavailable to women whose appearance was strictly regulated. Morning meals were typically simple rice porridge with pickled vegetables, perhaps a small portion of dried fish if the house was well provisioned. Food distribution often reflected the internal hierarchy of the Jissing house. Records from 1782 describe a dispute in a Pyongyang establishment where a senior Jissing disciplined a junior for complaining about unequal portions, reflecting the often tense dynamics within these superficially sisterly communities. After breakfast came practice. Regardless of their level of accomplishment, Jissings maintained rigorous practice schedules throughout their careers. The sounds of Geogeum and Geomungo would fill the courtyards of Jissing houses, creating what one visiting Chinese diplomat in 1795 described as a constant orchestral tuning that never resolves into performance. Mid-morning might bring official duties at government offices. Middle and lower-ranking Jissings often performed clerical work, copying documents, preparing and serving tea, or assisting with household management in government buildings. These mundane responsibilities are often overlooked in romanticized accounts, but constituted a significant portion of many Jissings' workloads. For those not assigned office duties, late morning and early afternoon were typically devoted to specialized training or preparation for upcoming performances. Costumes would be maintained, repaired, aired out, and pressed with heated stones. Instruments would be restrung or tuned. New songs or dances would be rehearsed, sometimes under the supervision of older Jissings who had transitioned from performance to teaching. A midday meal might be taken communally or on the run, depending on the day's schedule. Again, simple fare predominated: rice, soup, and side dishes that varied with the seasons and the house's finances. Some houses maintained vegetable gardens tended by the Jissings themselves, supplementing their diets and providing ingredients for medicinal preparations. The afternoon would often bring visitors to the Jissing house. These weren't exclusively male patrons seeking entertainment. The houses functioned as social hubs where various business might be conducted. Merchants might arrive selling silks or cosmetics. Herbalists would deliver medicinal ingredients. Occasionally, mothers hoping to apprentice their daughters would come to be assessed by the house manager. By late afternoon, Jissings would begin preparing for evening engagements. These might include official banquets, private gatherings hosted by Yongbin officials, or performances at the Jissing house itself. Preparation was intensive. Formal attire could involve multiple layers of clothing, elaborate accessories, and makeup that needed to be suitable for candlelight rather than daylight viewing. Evening performances could stretch late into the night. A banquet might begin at dusk and continue until the small hours of the morning, with Jissings expected to remain alert, engaged, and entertaining throughout. A house register from 1803 records a complaint from a Jissing who had been required to perform at 3 consecutive banquets over 36 hours, with almost no sleep, an extreme case, perhaps, but indicative of the physical demands placed on these women. Upon returning to the Jissing house, often in the early hours of the morning, women would carefully remove their makeup and costumes. Skincare was taken seriously. Natural cleansers made from rice water or camellia oil were used to remove makeup, followed by herbal preparations believed to maintain youthful appearances. These beauty rituals weren't merely about vanity, but economic necessity in a profession where appearance significantly impacted earning potential. Sleep, when it came, was often brief. The cycle would begin again before dawn, with little consideration for the physical toll of this schedule. Medical records from the period suggest that many Jissings suffered from chronic exhaustion, digestive disorders, and respiratory ailments. Unsurprising given their working conditions. The physical spaces of Jissing life were more varied than often portrayed. In Seoul, the government established several districts where Jissing houses were concentrated. The most famous was Jeowedong, which by the late 18th century had become a vibrant entertainment district with dozens of establishments ranging from elaborate houses serving high officials to more modest venues catering to provincial visitors. Provincial cities had their own Jissing districts, typically located near government offices. These were less concentrated than in the capital, with houses often scattered among other buildings, rather than clustered in dedicated neighborhoods. In smaller towns, Jissings might be housed in a wing of the local government office itself, lacking even the limited autonomy of a separate residence. The architecture of Jissing houses generally followed traditional Korean residential design, with important modifications. Most were built around one or more courtyards, with separate areas for performance, living quarters, and administrative functions. Unlike ordinary homes, they typically featured at least one large room suitable for group performances and entertaining. Privacy was limited. Junior Jissings usually shared sleeping quarters, while more established performers might have small private rooms. House managers and retired Jissings occupied the most comfortable spaces, reflecting the internal hierarchy. Storage was perpetually insufficient. Costumes, instruments, and personal belongings competed for space in crowded quarters. Sanitation was a persistent challenge. Most houses relied on communal bathing facilities, often just wooden tubs filled with heated water. During cold weather, full bathing might be limited to once every few days, with sponge bathing in between. Waste disposal followed the standard practices of the era. Chamber pots emptied into exterior collection points, with all the associated odors and hygiene issues. The health concerns of Jissing life were numerous and often serious. Cosmetics containing lead and mercury caused chronic poisoning. Tight corsets, gai worn to create fashionable silhouettes, restricted breathing, and compressed internal organs. Sexually transmitted infections were a constant risk, as were pregnancies, which could end a woman's career if not addressed through herbs that induced miscarriage, a dangerous procedure in itself. Some houses employed resident female herbalists who specialized in treating Jissing's health issues. These women, often former Jissings themselves, developed expertise in everything from treating performance-related injuries to managing menstrual difficulties and venereal diseases. Their knowledge was passed orally from one generation to the next, constituting a parallel medical tradition rarely acknowledged in official medical texts. Pregnancy and motherhood present particularly complex aspects of Jissing life. Children born to Jissings typically inherited their mother's status. Daughters usually entered the profession, while sons could potentially be adopted out or raised within the Jissing community in support roles. A house register from 1815 lists 3 young boys living in a Pyongyang Jising house, employed as errand runners and instrument carriers. Daughters raised in Jising houses grew up immersed in the culture and training of the profession, often beginning informal instruction years before official training began. This generational continuity created lineages of artistic specialization, families known for particular styles of dance or musical interpretation that were preserved and refined over decades. Financial arrangements within Jising houses varied considerably. Government-registered Jisings received stipends, though these were typically meager. Their main income came from gifts and payments from patrons, of which the house took a substantial percentage. A ledger from 1824 shows a prominent Seoul house taking 60% of all payments, leaving performers with less than half of what they ostensibly earned. These economic structures created significant disparities within the Jising community. The most accomplished and favored women could accumulate considerable wealth through generous patrons, occasionally even purchasing property through male proxies, since legal restrictions prevented direct ownership. Meanwhile, less fortunate Jisings lived in perpetual debt to their houses, paying for costumes, instruments, and even basic necessities through arrangements that resembled indentured servitude. By the early 19th century, a parallel economy had developed around Jising houses. Merchants specialized in supplying the specific silks, cosmetics, and accessories required by performers. Instrument makers maintained workshops nearby. Seamstresses, hairdressers, and various service providers clustered around these establishments, creating microeconomies dependent on Jising activities. The emotional landscape behind the painted screens was perhaps the most complex aspect of Jising life. These women navigated a bewildering range of relationships, competitive yet supportive connections with peers, hierarchical interactions with house managers and officials, intimate yet transactional encounters with patrons, and often complicated feelings toward children conceived through professional relationships. Surviving letters between Jisings reveal networks of friendship and support that helped make their difficult lives bearable. A collection from the 1830s includes correspondence between former housemates separated by assignments to different provinces, sharing professional advice, personal news, and emotional encouragement. One particularly touching letter describes how a senior Jising secretly taught her specialty dance to her friend's daughter, ensuring the younger woman would have a valuable skill to support herself. Religious and spiritual practices formed another significant aspect of private Jising life. Many maintained personal shrines combining Buddhist, Confucian, and shamanic elements. Divination was widely practiced before important performances or meetings with new patrons. Some houses conducted regular rituals to honor deceased members of their community, creating a sense of continuity and remembrance. The relationship between Jisings and traditional Korean shamanism, Musak, was particularly significant. Many Jisings consulted shamans, Mudang, regularly, and some became practitioners themselves later in life. The connection made practical sense. Both professions were dominated by women. Both existed at the margins of respectable society while performing necessary cultural functions, and both involved performance skills and spiritual knowledge. A government report from 1841 complains about former Jissings practicing as shamans in the capital, suggesting this career transition was common enough to attract official notice and disapproval. For women aging out of the entertainment profession, shamanic practice offered both economic support and a continued role within the community. As Jissings aged, their positions within houses changed. Those with teaching abilities might transition to instructional roles. Others took on administrative responsibilities, managing younger performers' schedules and finances. Some specialized in costume creation or maintenance. The least fortunate descended to domestic service, working as cooks or cleaners in the same houses where they once performed. The end of a Jissing's career wasn't formally defined, but typically arrived when declining appearance or health made performance impractical. Without family support, which many lacked due to their separated status, older Jissings faced precarious futures. Some managed to retire with savings or ongoing support from longtime patrons. Others remained in Jissing houses in support roles. The most vulnerable ended up as street performers or beggars, a fate recorded in several social commentaries from the late Joseon period. Behind the painted screens, Jissings created communities that functioned as surrogate families, professional networks, and support systems. These bonds, formed through shared experience and mutual dependence, represent one of the most overlooked aspects of Jissing life. The ways in which women pushed to society's margins created interconnected lives that offered some measure of security in an insecure world. The painted screens that separated Jissing quarters from the outside world served both practical and metaphorical functions. They provided minimal privacy while creating the illusion of separation between performance and reality. Yet, the women who lived behind these screens moved constantly between worlds, the public sphere of artistic display and the private realm of daily survival, navigating boundaries with the same grace they brought to their dances. You're still awake. I'm impressed, though I'm not sure if that's a testament to your insomnia or my storytelling abilities. Either way, let's continue our journey through the flower world of Joseon's Jissings. And now we arrive at the most delicate dance of all, not the ones performed in gilded chambers to entertain nobles, but the intricate footwork required to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics. Because when kings fell and rose, when factions warred and purges swept through the corridors of power, the Jissings were always there, watching, listening, and most importantly, surviving. Court politics in Joseon, Korea resembled nothing so much as a nest of vipers dipped in honey, beautiful to observe from a distance, but deadly to touch without the proper precautions. The political landscape was dominated by competing factions of Yongbin aristocrats, constantly jockeying for royal favor. And yet, floating somewhat outside this rigid hierarchy were the Jissings, neither fully within the system nor entirely outside it. This liminal position was both their greatest vulnerability and their unexpected strength. Consider the case of Wang Jinyi, whom we discussed earlier. Her legendary status wasn't earned solely through her artistic prowess. Historical records reveal her extraordinary ability to maintain relationships with powerful men across factional divides. When the Eastern and Western factions engaged in their infamous power struggles during the 16th century, Wang cultivated patrons in both camps. One Yongbin official reportedly remarked that the woman Jinyi speaks with the intelligence of 10 scholars, but reveals the loyalty of none. What he meant as criticism was actually her survival strategy. For an ordinary woman in Joseon society, taking sides in political disputes was unthinkable. Women were expected to remain outside the realm of politics entirely. But Jissings, by virtue of their profession, were pulled into the vortex of political intrigue, whether they wished it or not. The banquets where they performed were often political in nature. The private gatherings they attended were forums for conspiracy, and the beds they shared might belong to tomorrow's minister or tomorrow's exile. There's a saying that survived from this period. A scholar once told me, while I was researching this script, that the fastest way for a secret to travel through Seoul was to whisper it to a Jissing after 3 cups of wine. The implication being, of course, that Jissings were information brokers of a sort. But this oversimplifies a much more complex reality. The Jissings weren't just passive conduits of information. They were active participants in their own survival. Take the political purges that regularly swept through the Joseon court. When King Yeonseungun conducted his notorious purges in the early 16th century, hundreds of officials were executed or exiled. And what happened to the Jissings associated with them? Those who had diversified their patronage networks survived. Those who had placed all their hopes on a single faction often disappeared into obscurity, or worse. One particularly fascinating document from the 17th century describes how a group of government office Jissings managed to maintain their positions through 3 separate regime changes. Their strategy included maintaining careful political neutrality in public, securing protection from officials of various factions, and perhaps most importantly, making themselves indispensable through their professional skills. One Jissing named Myungwal reportedly survived by being the only performer who could properly execute a particular ritual dance required at important state ceremonies. Practical skills, it seems, sometimes trumped political allegiances. But let's not romanticize this too much. For every Jissing who successfully navigated these troubled waters, countless others were likely swept away. The royal court was particularly dangerous, as proximity to the king was both the greatest opportunity and the greatest threat. Court Jissings who caught a monarch's eye might enjoy brief periods of extraordinary favor and the jealousy of everyone around them. The histories record several instances of favored Jissings receiving gifts of land, exemption from certain duties, or even permission to marry outside their social class. But such favor was fickle and could turn deadly. During the reign of King Sukjong in the late 17th century, the infamous Jissing Jang Okeyung, later known as Lady Jang or Jang Huibin, rose from humble origins to become a royal concubine, and eventually the legal queen after the deposition of Queen In-hyun. Her rise was meteoric, and her fall was just as dramatic. When political fortunes shifted again, she was accused of witchcraft and poisoning, then executed by poison in 1701. Her story is extreme but illustrative. The political stage was perilous for Jissings, and those who played for the highest stakes faced the greatest dangers. But it wasn't just at court where political acumen mattered. Provincial Jissings had to navigate their own microcosm of political intrigue. Each time a new governor or magistrate arrived from the capital, the local Jissing house had to quickly assess the newcomer's tastes, political affiliations, and temperament. An official with a reputation for virtue might need to be approached with studied restraint and scholarly conversation. One known for corruption might expect more direct forms of entertainment and payment. Getting this wrong could mean anything from loss of income to physical punishment. You have to understand, a historian once explained to me that in Joseon Korea, everything was political, even poetry. A seemingly innocent verse about falling blossoms could be read as commentary on the fleeting nature of political power. A song about loyal love might contain coded references to factional allegiances. Jissings, as cultural producers and performers, had to be exquisitely attuned to these subtleties. The wrong song performed for the wrong audience could spell disaster. This brings us to an aspect of Jissing political survival that's often overlooked: their role as cultural preservationists during political transitions. When the Imjin War broke out in 1592 and Japanese forces invaded Korea, cultural continuity was threatened alongside political sovereignty. Many scholarly works were destroyed and traditions disrupted. Interestingly, some records indicate that Jissings played a crucial role in preserving certain musical traditions and dance forms during this period of upheaval. Their marginalized status sometimes allowed them to fly under the radar during times when elite culture was under direct attack. Similarly, during the factional purges known as Sawa that periodically convulsed the Joseon court, Jissings often preserved the literary and artistic traditions of disgraced factions. When scholars were exiled or executed and their works destroyed, the songs and poems they had taught to their Jissing companions sometimes survived, memorized, and passed down through the generations. This cultural preservation was not just artistic, but political, a subtle form of resistance against the erasure of memory. It's getting quite late now, isn't it? But I hope you're still with me, drifting through these corridors of power and survival, because there's something profoundly modern about the way these women navigated systems that were explicitly designed to exclude and exploit them. They couldn't vote. They couldn't hold office. They couldn't even represent themselves in legal proceedings. And yet, they found ways to exert influence, to protect themselves, and occasionally to shape the course of events around them. Most remarkably of all, they did this without the benefit of formal political education. While Yongbin's sons studied the Confucian classics and histories that prepared them for government service, Jissings had no such systematic training in political theory. What they had instead was something potentially more valuable: direct observation of power in action. They saw officials at their most unguarded, heard conversations not meant for public consumption, and witnessed the gap between public virtue and private vice. This gave them a kind of political education that was intensely practical rather than theoretical. In many ways, the political strategies of Jissings, networking, information gathering, alliance building, and careful public performance, mirror the survival tactics of marginalized groups throughout history. The difference is that Jissings employed these strategies not just collectively, but individually, in a system that offered them few formal protections, but many informally negotiated spaces for agency. The line between protection and possession has always been perilously thin, hasn't it? Especially for those who lack power of their own. As we slip deeper into the night, let's unravel maybe the most misunderstood aspect of Jissing life: their relationships. Because behind the romantic myths of star-crossed lovers and the crude stereotypes of mere sexual transactions lay a reality far more complex, a web of connections that could determine whether a Jissing prospered or perished in the unforgiving world of Joseon Korea. You've probably noticed by now that I've barely mentioned love. That's not an oversight. In a society where marriages were arranged for political and economic advantage, romantic love was considered at best a pleasant but unnecessary bonus, and at worst, a dangerous distraction from filial duty. This was doubly true for Jissings, whose professional success depended on maintaining multiple relationships with powerful men while avoiding the appearance of exclusive attachment to any one of them. The primary relationship in a Jissing's life was often with her patron, or Hubang. These weren't mere customers, but long-term supporters who provided financial backing, political protection, and social connections. A successful patron Jissing relationship might last for years or even decades, with the patron paying for the Jissing's living expenses, training costs, and sometimes even purchasing her contract outright. In return, the Jissing provided entertainment, companionship, and usually sexual services, though the nature and exclusivity of these arrangements varied widely. It was a business partnership wrapped in the language of sentiment. As one historian rather clinically put it to me, and indeed, historical records reveal a surprising level of business acumen among successful Jissings. Take the case of Jewel Hyang, a Jissing from the late 18th century, whose preserved letters show her negotiating with a Yongbin patron over the terms of their arrangement, specifying exactly what gifts she expected, how often she would entertain him, and what financial support he would provide for her aging mother. Not exactly the stuff of romantic poetry, is it? Though, ironically, this same Jissing is known for some rather beautiful love poems. For Jissings of lower status, these arrangements were often less formalized and more exploitative. Provincial Jissings might be temporarily claimed by traveling officials during their posting to the region, only to be abandoned when the official returned to Seoul. The precariousness of these relationships created a constant pressure to secure new patrons before old ones disappeared. But what about actual romantic love? Did it exist in this commodified landscape of sex and power? The historical record suggests that yes, it did, and it was about as sensible as bringing a lit torch into a gunpowder storage room. The love affairs between Jissings and their clients that have survived in historical records are disproportionately tragic, ending in suicide, social disgrace, or exile. These weren't just romantic obstacles to be overcome. They were relationships that fundamentally challenged the hierarchical structure of Joseon society. Take, for example, the infamous case of Cho Seung-ro, a high-ranking official who became so infatuated with a Jissing named Wal Hyung in the early 15th century that he neglected his duties and eventually lost his position. Or the even more scandalous affair between the Jissing Nonggi and a military officer, which ended with both committing suicide rather than being separated when the officer was reassigned to a distant post. These stories were preserved not as romantic ideals, but as cautionary tales about the dangers of uncontrolled passion. For most Jissings, a more pragmatic approach to relationships was necessary for survival. Many maintained multiple patrons simultaneously, carefully managing each relationship to avoid jealousy while maximizing support. A common strategy was to cultivate different types of relationships with different men, perhaps a wealthy merchant for financial support, a government official for political protection, and a scholar for social prestige. This portfolio approach to relationship management required extraordinary social intelligence and emotional control. Perhaps surprisingly, not all relationships between Jissings and their patrons were sexual in nature. Some Yongbin scholars sought out Jissings primarily for intellectual and artistic companionship. These relationships, while still framed by unequal power dynamics, sometimes evolved into genuine artistic collaborations. The poems written by Jissings and their scholarly patrons often took the form of exchanges, with verses responding to each other in a literary conversation that could span years. I'm not suggesting these were relationships of equals. They weren't. But they weren't simple exploitation either. They existed in that uncomfortable gray area where genuine connection and systemic power imbalance coexist, much like many relationships throughout history. Beyond their relationships with patrons, Jissings maintained complex social networks with each other. The popular image of Jissings as cutthroat competitors, scratching and clawing for the attention of wealthy men, is largely a fictional construct. Historical evidence suggests that successful Jissings often formed tight-knit communities, sharing resources, information, and protection. Senior Jissings mentored juniors, taught them practical survival skills not covered in their formal training, and sometimes even arranged partnerships with reliable patrons. These female solidarity networks were crucial during times of crisis. When a patron fell from political favor, his associated Jissing might suddenly find herself vulnerable to persecution. In such cases, support from fellow Jissings could mean the difference between survival and ruin. There are accounts of Jissings pooling resources to help one of their own escape a dangerous situation, or providing temporary housing and support until a new patron could be secured. The flower world had its own unwritten code, an expert on Jising culture once told me, and at its center was the understanding that today's favorite could be tomorrow's outcast. The wheel of fortune turned quickly, and no one understood this better than the women who lived at its mercy. That's not to say that relationships between Jisings were uniformly supportive. Competition was real, particularly among those serving at court or in high-demand pleasure houses. A particularly beautiful or talented new arrival could threaten the livelihood of established Jisings, leading to instances of sabotage, slander, or outright bullying. Some historical records mention Jisings deliberately undermining rivals by spreading rumors about disease or bad character, or even arranging for accidents before important performances. But perhaps the most complex relationship of all was the one between Jisings and their own children. Pregnancy was an occupational hazard, and many Jisings bore children to their patrons or clients. Sons born to Jisings generally took on the status of their mothers, becoming low-status entertainers, servants, or, if they were lucky, apprenticed to a craft. Daughters, however, typically followed their mothers into the Jising profession, creating generations of women bound to the same system. Some patrons acknowledged and supported their children by Jisings, providing education and occasionally even a path to legitimate status through adoption or official recognition. More commonly, however, these children remained in a social limbo, neither fully acknowledged nor completely abandoned, carrying the burden of their mother's status regardless of their father's rank. For many Jisings, securing a better future for their children became a primary motivation. Historical records contain numerous petitions from Jisings seeking to have their children, particularly daughters, released from automatic enrollment in the Jising registry. These petitions rarely succeeded without substantial bribes or extraordinary patronage, but they reveal the desperate hope these women maintained for their children to escape the life they themselves had been forced into. Beyond these personal relationships lay the fundamental power dynamic that shaped all aspects of Jising existence: their relationship to the state itself. Legally classified as public women, Gongyi, most Jisings were essentially government property, registered in official ledgers and subject to assignment wherever their services were required. This status as human property extended to their bodies, their labor, and their art. The state that mandated their training also claimed the right to deploy their skills as needed, whether entertaining foreign diplomats, performing at official ceremonies, or serving the pleasures of local officials. This brings us to an uncomfortable reality that's often glossed over in more romanticized accounts of Jising life: the element of coercion that underpinned the entire system. While some women voluntarily entered the profession seeking financial stability or artistic training, many others were sold into it by desperate families, assigned to it as punishment for crimes their own or family members, or born into it with no choice whatsoever. For these women, relationships with powerful patrons weren't just opportunities for advancement. They were sometimes the only protection available against systematic abuse, It would be easy to end this section on a note of simple exploitation, powerful men using vulnerable women. But that narrative, while containing truth, denies the agency and complexity that historical Gissings demonstrated in navigating these relationships. Many turned the very system designed to exploit them into a tool for their own survival and occasional advancement. They cultivated patrons who could offer protection, negotiated the terms of their service, built networks of mutual support, and sometimes even managed to buy their freedom or secure better futures for their children. The puppet masters often found their puppets had strings of their own to pull, and in Josian's rigid social hierarchy, these women wrote their own stories of survival, often with whatever ink was available to them, on whatever scraps of paper history would allow. Let's be clear about something as you drift closer to sleep. Resistance doesn't always look like rebellion. In a society as rigidly hierarchical and closely monitored as Joseon Korea, open defiance by marginalized people was nearly always suicidal. For Gissings, whose every movement was scrutinized and whose bodies were quite literally state property, traditional forms of resistance were largely unavailable. They couldn't organize protests. They couldn't publish manifestos. They couldn't refuse their duties without severe punishment. And yet, they found ways to resist. Their primary weapons were the very talents they had been forced to develop: poetry, music, dance, and art. These became the vehicles through which they could express sentiments that would have been dangerous or impossible to voice directly. Through careful metaphor, subtle allusion, and artistic coding, they created what scholars now recognize as a distinctive tradition of female resistance literature. Take, for example, the poem attributed to the Jissing Mihwa from the 16th century. The spring wind enters the gate of the rich man's house, but what of the falling blossoms outside the wall? They too once belonged to the same branch, yet now drift separately on different currents. On its surface, this is a simple nature poem about cherry blossoms, the kind of innocuous seasonal verse that was common in Joseon literature. But to a knowing reader, it speaks volumes about social inequality, the arbitrary nature of status distinctions, and the poet's awareness of her own marginalization. The rich man's house represents the Yongbin aristocracy, while the falling blossoms outside symbolize Jissings and other lower status people. The reminder that they once belonged to the same branch is a subtle but pointed challenge to the Confucian justification for social hierarchy. Such poems weren't just private expressions of discontent. Jissings performed their poetry at gatherings attended by the very officials who controlled their lives. The audacity of speaking truth to power while appearing to simply entertain represents a sophisticated form of resistance that scholars are only now beginning to fully appreciate. Music offered similar opportunities for subversion. Jissings were masters of traditional Korean musical forms, but they were also innovators who developed and preserved distinctly female musical traditions. Some of these songs used conventional melodies, but featured lyrics that subtly challenged social norms or expressed forbidden emotions like anger, desire, or resentment. The most famous example is probably Seisalga, a genre of narrative songs that often told stories of ill-fated love affairs, abandoned women, or social injustice. While performing these songs, Jissings could express emotions that would have been considered inappropriate in normal social discourse. The songs became a safe space for emotional truths that couldn't be spoken directly. It's rather like those Renaissance court jesters, a musicologist once explained to me, who could speak dangerous truths to kings as long as they framed them as jokes. Jissings could express profound social critique as long as it was embedded in entertainment. The difference is that the jesters were acknowledged as having this role, while Jissings had to disguise their critique much more carefully. Dance provided yet another medium for subtle resistance. Jissings were trained in various court and folk dance traditions, each with its own symbolic vocabulary of movements. By subtly altering traditional movements or incorporating elements from different dance traditions, they could communicate messages that weren't apparent to casual observers, but would be recognized by other Jissings or sympathetic viewers. One particularly fascinating example is the evolution of Salpuri dance, originally a shamanistic ritual dance for expelling evil spirits. As performed by Jissings, it gradually incorporated elements that scholars now interpret as representing the expulsion of social oppression and psychological trauma. The white cloth that the dancer manipulates throughout the performance became a metaphor for the Jissing herself, twisted, thrown, and manipulated by external forces, yet ultimately finding a form of grace and resolution. Even the visual arts became vehicles for resistance. Jissings who were trained in painting often produced works that appeared to conform to conventional subjects, like flowers, birds, or landscapes, but contained subtle deviations from traditional technique or unexpected symbolic elements. A seemingly traditional painting of bamboo might include an unusual break in one stalk, a visual metaphor for resilience despite being bent or broken by circumstance. But perhaps the most audacious form of resistance was in the realm of language itself. Jissings were among the first Korean women to achieve literacy in Hangul, the Korean alphabet created in the 15th century. While elite Yongbin men focused on Chinese characters as the language of scholarship and government, many Jissings became proficient in Hangul and used it to write poetry, letters, and songs that wouldn't have been possible in classical Chinese. This linguistic choice was itself politically significant. By writing in Hangul rather than Chinese characters, Jissings were aligning themselves with a more accessible, native Korean tradition rather than the imported Chinese cultural forms favored by the elite. Their work helped preserve and develop a distinctly Korean literary voice during periods when official culture was heavily influenced by Chinese models. There's an entry in the annals of the Joseon dynasty a literary historian shared with me, complaining about Jissings using vulgar script, Hangul, to write improper songs that were spreading among common people. The official who wrote this clearly saw it as a threat to proper cultural authority, and he wasn't entirely wrong. It was a form of cultural resistance through popularization. Beyond these artistic forms of resistance, Jissings developed more practical strategies for maintaining some control over their circumstances. They created information networks that allowed them to warn each other about particularly abusive officials or dangerous political situations. They developed codes and signals to communicate secretly while under observation. Some even managed to accumulate enough wealth or favors to buy their way out of the registry, effectively purchasing freedom from their state-mandated role. One particularly remarkable form of resistance was the maintenance of spiritual practices that existed outside the Confucian orthodoxy. Many Jissings maintained connections to shamanic traditions, participating in rituals that honored female deities and spiritual powers not recognized in official Neo-Confucian practice. These traditions provided an alternative value system that recognized female power and agency in ways that mainstream culture did not. I should note that not all artistic expression by Jissings was consciously resistant or subversive. Much of their work did conform to conventional aesthetic standards and social expectations. Like artists in any restrictive society, they had to calculate carefully when and how to push boundaries. A Jissing who was too openly critical might find herself without patrons, assigned to a remote provincial post, or subjected to physical punishment. And yet, the cumulative record of their artistic production reveals a persistent thread of subtle resistance, a whispered conversation among the women themselves about their experiences, their desires, and their awareness of the injustices that shaped their lives. This conversation wasn't always intended for outside ears, but we can hear echoes of it in the works that have survived. These weren't just entertainment workers. One scholar emphasized to me during my research, they were cultural producers in their own right, creating art that spoke to their unique social position. The fact that they did this while navigating incredible constraints on their freedom makes their achievement all the more remarkable. The most profound form of resistance was simply the insistence on maintaining a sense of self in a system designed to treat them as interchangeable commodities. Historical records contain numerous accounts of Jissings who established distinctive artistic identities, developed personal styles that were recognized and valued, and insisted on being known for their individual talents rather than just their category. This assertion of individuality was itself a challenge to the system. If Jissings were meant to be fungible units of entertainment, classified, registered, and deployed according to state needs, then the development of a distinctive artistic voice was a form of resistance to that commodification. By becoming not just any Jissing, but specifically Eichuang Jinyi, or Nongyi, or Julhyang, women whose names and works were remembered, they refused the anonymity that the system tried to impose on them. I find myself wondering, as the night grows deeper, what these women would think about us discussing them now, centuries later. Would they be surprised that their small acts of creative resistance eventually reached a world they could scarcely have imagined? Or would they simply nod, knowing that they had embedded their truths so carefully within their art that eventually someone would notice. These were women who lived lives of profound contradiction, required to master elite cultural forms while being denied elite status, expected to embody artistic refinement while being treated as bodies for sale, trained to perform emotions they might not feel while concealing emotions they genuinely experienced. That they found ways to express authentic experiences within these constraints is a testament not just to their artistic skill, but to the fundamental human need to speak truth, even when truth must disguise itself to survive. As we've journeyed through their world tonight, I hope you've come to see Jissings not just as victims of an oppressive system, though they certainly were that, but also as creative agents who carved out spaces for expression and resistance within the narrow margins they were allowed. Their brushes and songs and dances were not just the tools of their trade, but the instruments of their survival as fully human beings in a system determined to reduce them to something less. Are you still with me? Let us complete our journey now by exploring how the Jissing tradition itself began its long, slow transformation during the twilight years of the Joseon dynasty, and how echoes of this complex cultural institution still reverberate through Korean society today. The 19th century brought profound changes to Korea. After centuries of isolation that had earned the kingdom its nickname as the Hermit Kingdom, Joseon was forcibly opened to Western influence through a series of unequal treaties beginning in the 1870s. Foreign diplomats, missionaries, traders, and adventurers began arriving in increasing numbers, bringing with them new technologies, ideas, and cultural practices that would fundamentally alter Korean society, including the world of the Jissing. These foreigners encountered the Jissing system with a mixture of fascination and moral condemnation. Western observers, particularly missionaries, tended to view Jissings through the lens of Victorian morality, focusing primarily on the sexual aspects of their role, while overlooking their artistic and cultural significance. In letters and journals from this period, foreigners described Jissings variously as dancing girls, Korean geishas, or more bluntly, prostitutes, categories that failed to capture the complexity of their social position. One American diplomat wrote in 1883, "The Jissing houses of Seoul represent a peculiar moral blindness in an otherwise admirable culture. These women, though accomplished in certain arts, are living in a state of sin that no amount of cultural tradition can justify." This moralistic framing would have profound consequences for how the Jissing tradition was treated during subsequent periods of modernization and reform. Ironically, at the same time, some Jissings became important cultural interpreters between Koreans and foreigners. Their training in entertainment and social graces, combined with their marginalized status that allowed them more freedom to interact with non-Koreans, positioned them as intermediaries in the complex cultural exchange that was beginning. Some learned basic phrases in English, French, or Russian to entertain foreign guests at diplomatic functions. Others became subjects of the first photographs taken in Korea. Their images, circulating internationally as exotic representatives of Korean culture. The most significant changes came with Japan's increasing influence over Korea, culminating in the annexation of 1910 that formally ended the Joseon dynasty and began 35 years of colonial rule. The Japanese colonial government undertook a systematic restructuring of Korean society, ostensibly in the name of modernization, but designed primarily to facilitate economic exploitation and cultural assimilation. For Jissings, this period brought a profound transformation of their institutional status. The traditional government registry system was disbanded, and in its place arose a more commercialized system, heavily influenced by the Japanese geisha model. New Gwanbyan rights associations were established as private training institutions and entertainment businesses. While these maintained some elements of traditional Jissing arts, they increasingly emphasized skills that appealed to Japanese clients and urban elites who had adopted Japanese tastes. It was a strange paradox, a cultural historian explained to me. On one hand, Jissings lost their official status as government entertainers, which in some ways increased their personal freedom. On the other hand, the commercialization of their profession often led to more direct sexual exploitation and less emphasis on their artistic traditions. And all of this was happening against the backdrop of colonial domination that was reshaping Korean cultural identity as a whole. Some Jissings adapted successfully to these changed circumstances. The most talented performers found new patrons among wealthy Japanese officials and businessmen, or among the emerging Korean urban elite who were navigating between traditional Korean identity and Japanese-influenced modernity. Historical records from this period mention Jissings who learned Japanese songs and dances to appeal to new audiences, while still preserving aspects of traditional Korean performance practice. Others found themselves pushed further into prostitution as the artistic aspects of their profession became less valued. The colonial government implemented a series of regulations that effectively placed Jissings in the same legal category as sex workers, requiring medical examinations and registration in ways that emphasized the sexual rather than cultural aspects of their work. This regulatory shift both reflected and reinforced a changing public perception of Jissings, primarily as entertainers, whose services included sex. During this twilight period, a fascinating cultural development occurred. Jissings became symbols of Korean cultural resistance to Japanese colonization. Despite the pressure to adopt Japanese performance styles, many Jissings deliberately maintained traditional Korean musical forms, dances, and cultural practices that were being suppressed in other contexts. Some became important preservers of Korean cultural heritage at a time when colonial policies were actively working to erase Korean cultural identity. The renowned Jissing Yimi Chang, for instance, became famous for her performances of traditional Korean court music at a time when such performances were becoming increasingly rare. Her insistence on maintaining these traditions represented a form of cultural resistance, preserving artistic lineages that might otherwise have been lost during the colonial period. Jissings also played a significant role in the emerging recording industry of the early 20th century. As phonograph technology reached Korea, Jissings were among the first Korean musicians to make commercial recordings. These recordings, distributed both within Korea and among Korean communities abroad, helped preserve traditional musical forms during a period of rapid cultural change. Today, these recordings are invaluable historical documents, not just of the music itself, but of a cultural tradition in transition. The colonial period also saw the emergence of new forms of entertainment that began to compete with and eventually displace traditional Jissing performances. Western-style theaters opened in Seoul and other cities, presenting new forms of drama and musical entertainment. The emerging film industry created new celebrities whose fame was spread through mass media rather than word of mouth. Radio brought music into private homes, reducing the need for live performers at gatherings. All of these developments gradually eroded the traditional cultural space that Jissings had occupied. By the 1930s and early 1940s, the institution was undergoing its final transformation. The most talented and business-savvy Jissings adapted by becoming professional performers in the modern sense, recording artists, actresses, or proprietors of entertainment establishments. Others continued in increasingly commercialized forms of entertainment that bore less and less resemblance to the complex artistic and social role of traditional Jissings. Many simply disappeared into the general population, their specialized knowledge and talents lost. World War II and the subsequent Korean War delivered the final blows to what remained of the traditional Jissing institution. The social upheaval, economic devastation, and massive population displacement caused by these conflicts destroyed much of the infrastructure and patronage networks that had supported even the modified forms of Jissing culture that had survived into the mid-20th century. In South Korea's post-war drive for rapid modernization and economic development, there was little interest in preserving what was increasingly viewed as a problematic relic of the feudal past. The emergence of Jissing tourism in the 1960s and 70s, where establishments used the term Jissing to market commercial sex to primarily Japanese tourists, further tainted the public perception of the tradition, reducing a complex cultural institution to a commercialized simulation designed for foreign consumption. And yet, the story doesn't end there. Beginning in the 1980s, as South Korea achieved economic stability and began to reevaluate its cultural heritage, scholars and artists initiated efforts to reclaim and recontextualize the Jissing tradition. Academic studies explored the artistic and literary contributions of historical Jissings. Performers began researching and reviving musical and dance traditions that had been preserved through Jissing lineages. Museums and cultural heritage organizations recognized the role of Jissings in maintaining Korean cultural forms during periods of foreign domination. Today, the legacy of the Jissing tradition exists in a complex space between historical appreciation and continued controversy. The artistic traditions they preserved, particularly in music, dance, and poetry, are now recognized as important components of Korean cultural heritage. Performers who have mastered these traditions are designated as living national treasures, preserving and teaching performance practices that might otherwise have been lost. At the same time, the Jising themselves remain somewhat ambiguous figures in Korean historical memory, simultaneously celebrated for their artistic accomplishments and marginalized for their sexual role in a society still influenced by Confucian values regarding female virtue. Popular culture reflects this ambivalence, with historical dramas and films alternately romanticizing Jisings as tragic heroines or depicting them as manipulative seductresses. Most significantly, contemporary feminist scholars and artists in Korea have begun re-examining the Jising tradition as part of a broader reconsideration of women's roles in Korean history, rather than viewing Jisings simply as victims of exploitation or exotic cultural curiosities. This new scholarship recognizes them as women who navigated extraordinary constraints to create art, exercise agency, and sometimes challenge the very system that defined them. A performance artist I spoke with who creates work inspired by historical Jisings told me, these women represent a paradox that still resonates today. They were simultaneously the most marginalized and the most culturally powerful women of their time. They couldn't vote or hold office or even legally represent themselves, but their songs and poems and dances shaped the cultural imagination of the nation. There's something profound there about the nature of power and resistance that speaks to contemporary questions about gender and art. As we approach the end of our journey tonight, I find myself thinking about how the story of the Jising is, in many ways, the story of art itself, how beauty emerges even from systems of control, how creative expression finds ways to flourish in the most inhospitable environments, how human beings insist on making meaning even when their agency is severely constrained. The flower world may have faded into history, but the blossoms it produced, songs, poems, dances, paintings, continue to release their fragrance into our world. The Jisings themselves are gone now, these women whose lives we've been exploring as you drift toward sleep. Their voices are silent, their dances stilled, their faces known only through a handful of paintings and early photographs. But something of their spirit persists in the traditional songs still performed today, in the dance movements passed down through generations, in the poems that still move readers centuries after they were written. And perhaps something of their spirit persists in all who create art from difficult circumstances, who find beauty amid constraint, who insist on their humanity in systems designed to deny it. In that sense, the world of the Jising never truly ended. It merely transformed, like all cultural traditions do, adapting its essential truths to new circumstances, while shedding the specific forms that could no longer be sustained. These women, born into circumstances beyond their control, carved out spaces for themselves in a world determined to deny them agency. They danced between expectation and rebellion, between duty and desire, creating art that would outlast the system that sought to consume them. Feel your breath deepening now as you let go of the mental images we've created. The sound of the Kayagyeum strings fading, the rustling silk of hanbok growing silent, the flickering oil lamps dimming in imagined pavilions where poetry once flowed like wine. The Jissings have shared their story with you tonight, across centuries and cultural divides. Their resilience, their artistry, their humanity despite all attempts to reduce them to mere commodities. These are the threads you can carry with you, even as the specific details of names and dates dissolve into the approaching horizon of sleep. Let the weight of history lift from you now. The journey is complete. The flower world has closed its blossoms for the night, leaving behind only the faintest trace of its perfume as you drift away into your own dreams, carrying perhaps some echo of these forgotten women's songs.